Santa Barbara, California. I met him. He set up an appointment with me while he was doing some research for his book on the shared crossing experience that I had, and he was gathering information so that he could publish a book on those experiences. And with that, I will turn it over to William Peters.
Thank you, Deb. And thank you, Bethany, and all of you. I want to start by saying that you'll see me look to the right. When I do this, I have two screens set up. So if I want to see you guys, I look to the right. So please don't think that I'm looking away. I'm just trying when I'm looking right straight forward as I'm doing right now, this is where my presentation is. Okay. I want to make sure, does everyone hear me okay? Are we ready to begin? Is there anything I need to know? Okay, great. So I can just start. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to present. It's always a pleasure to present to an IANDS group. As you'll see, I've had a couple of NDEs myself, and it just gives a really wonderful foundation for the material we're going to be talking about tonight. So diving right in, I just want to say a little bit about me so you know where I'm coming from. I had my first near-death experience in 1979. It was a high-speed skiing accident, crushed my low back, and was immediately catapulted out of my body. And as I was sailing away from the earth, I could see Lake Tahoe and then the continental U.S. and then, Earth. And I was just enamored as I was going away from the planet we all share. And then I realized I was having a life review at the same time. And then I was into this kind of rib tunnel, but I could still see through it, saw the whole, solar system, if you will. And I was just enamored. And then I saw the light, and then I realized I'm dying. And I realized I'd been here before. And I did not, like so many near-death experiencers, unlike so many near-death experiencers, I did not want to die. I said, oh my God, I don't want to die. I haven't done what I came here to do. And it was that's just what surfaced in me right away. And then I went into the light and stopped. And I just remember feeling, just so warm and comfortable in the light. And I was still pleading. I mean, I was only 17 years old. So I was like, I was clear I was with God because I grew up Catholic, and I was talking, kind of commanding God in a certain way, saying, I don't want to die. I'm not ready. I have to do more. I didn't accomplish what I came here to accomplish. And then all of a sudden there was this very loving but strong push back on me. And I heard, or how this is telepathically, make something of your life. And I spun backwards and redid everything again and kind of wrote on this. I was wondering, how am I going to get back in this body? And I made it back. Here I am. And I didn't talk about that experience with anybody for probably about 15 years. But it changed me. And I was at 17 years old, I was going to prep school in Northern California, and I gradually started this internal shift in consciousness. For one, I was in chronic pain. My back injury was severe, and it was no longer active doing any type of sports, which I'd really been doing a lot of. So I lost my identity, I lost my freedom in my physical body. And I was learning I was doing a lot of questioning about what is the purpose of life and what makes a meaningful life. And so from this rather suburban prep school education, I went to UC Berkeley, and the first job I took out of school was teaching high school in Central America. Got fascinated on working with people who were, from our perspective or my perspective at the time, under-resourced, underprivileged, as you might say. And I ended up taking another position in Peru, And I was working with Aymara Indians who were being displaced during a civil war there. And I was exposed to this beautiful shamanistic culture in the midst of a civil war with a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of poverty and hunger and disease. I noticed that these Aymaran shaman leaders were very much calm and very peaceful. And when I learned more about how they saw things, they said this was just part of a larger journey. That the earth realm can be difficult, can be beautiful, can be a lot of things, but not to sweat it. Everything continues, and we go on from here. And they were so much more at peace with the trials and tribulations of their life than I was, who was there to help out. So I returned from Peru, took a job in San Francisco in the Tenderloin as a social worker. And I was hired because I was fluent in Spanish, but the AIDS epidemic was starting, and during the time that I worked, it really exploded. So I found myself working with a lot of primarily men who had HIV, the HIV virus, and they were dying very, I would say, horrific death. And because they would have lesions all over their body, they froth in their mouth. These were very painful to be with. But I learned a great deal about how to be with people in a great deal of suffering. And I learned it through the communities that were forming in my late 20s. So that was a very formative experience. It was also there that people, as a social worker and counselor, people would come to me and share their experiences. And they were starting to share what will later I will explain as the shared death experience, which is the focus of our talk tonight. Anyway, a few years later, I had my second near-death experience. My blood platelets crashed. I was in a hemophiliac condition and found myself in the 10th floor of Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, suspended, hovering just below the ceiling and watching life in an ICU. Nurses talking about patients, janitors hiding in closets, the traumas that people are dealing with, an intensive care unit. And then at some point, the doctor came up to my bed, and I was still hovering above my bed, and he touched my arm and said, Mr. Peters, I want to talk to you. And I had this decision to make. Do I want to go back into that body, or do I want to stay up here? I thought I'd answer his question. When I did answer his question, I went right back into my body. And as far as I'm concerned, I stayed there for a while, maybe never left it since then in a certain way. But I was very fascinated with death and dying at this point, but still not talking about my NDEs at all. I didn't even know if they had a name at that point. But I did have a few more experiences with family members, and I signed up for Zen Hospice Project in year 2000, which was a very avant-garde hospice in San Francisco. And it was there that I ended up having my first shared death experience, and I'll share that right now. I was working with a gentleman named Ron, who was a merchant marine. He had traveled all around the world, as part of his job, and he really liked being read stories. He was, by the time this event takes place, he was semi-conscious. And so I was reading to him a Jack London story, which he loved. He loved adventure stories. And all of a sudden, in the midst of the story, I found myself floating above my body right next to Ron. And I looked over at Ron, and Ron looked over at me. Ron looked very confident, very possessed, very comfortable, and looked at me as if to say, check this out. As if to say, this is where I've been spending some time. And, take a look around. As if he invited me there. And I don't know if that's what happened, but I was shocked, quite frankly. I was like, oh my God. But I knew this space from my previous SDE in the ICU. So I came back into my body afterwards, and I don't even think I stopped reading to Ron, to be honest. I think these two spheres of existence are kind of parallel universes, if you will. But I was changed by that experience as well. But I still didn't do a whole lot with it until 2009, which would be some 7 years later. When I met Raymond Moody, he was giving a talk at the Omega Institute, which is more in your neighborhood, actually. And he talked about the shared death experience. I was there to hear about the near-death experience, but he was writing a book on the shared death experience. And as soon as I heard that, I said, oh my gosh, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I went up to Raymond and I said, I've had these experiences. I was a hospice worker, and I think I know, actually, I think I said to him, I think I know how to make these happen, actually. And he and I struck up a conversation, and that began a relationship with Raymond. He was very supportive of my work with the Shared Crossing Project and the developing research we've conducted. And so I started developing these methods to facilitate a shared death experience, and that continues to today. We continue to learn about it. I was trying these methods out with various friends and family at the beginning, because I do have a psychotherapy practice where I work with a lot of people at end of life. But I wasn't practicing with them until I really got a sense for if they would even work. And I had a breakthrough experience with Sandy, who was a family friend, and she was dying of ovarian cancer in her early 60s. And she said, I want you to teach me the protocols for this shared death experience. She had read Raymond's book, Glimpses of Eternity, which talked about the shared death experience. And she goes, I want to have this with my family. And I said, well, we can do that, but I usually work with people who are like with loved ones. I want to teach your loved ones how to go into the afterlife with you. She said, none of my family members even believe in the afterlife. I said, wow, okay. So she goes, but will you teach me as best you can? Well, I did actually spend a couple sessions with her teaching her the protocols, these methods that enable a shared death experience. And about a week later, she died, and a week later, her daughter calls me and says, listen, I know you were working with my mom about some spiritual experiences, about how to have them. I want to share with you what happened to me. When my mom was dying, I was in the next room, down the hall, a few rooms down the hall. And in the middle of the night, I felt this pull upon my chest. And I resisted it because I thought it was pulling me out of my body. And I did not want to go. I thought I might be dying. But then I saw in the distance a little being, which looked like a being with blonde hair. And I thought, that's my daughter. I have to go get my daughter. So I went with this pull, and I went up close to that being. And when that being turned around, it was my mother. My mother said to me, she says, you see, I'm alive and well. I will love you always. Go back and live your life. And that was the experience she shared with me. And I said, well, you had a shared death experience. You experienced this part of this transition with your mother. So with that, I got really excited, and I started the Shared Crossing Project. And here's the mission. It's a simple mission to raise awareness and educate people about these profound and healing experiences that are available to the dying and the loved ones at the end of a human life. About a few months later, we started the Shared Crossing Research Initiative. You can see our team here. We have Dr. Monica Williams, our medical director, Dr. Michael Kinsella, who's our research director. And you'll see, you can't see my screen?
No, we can't see your screen.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, let me go to the screen. Oh, God,
You would choose the present now in the bottom of your video.
Window. Gosh, thank you. I'm so glad. I would have gone on forever. That's okay. Okay. So, how's that? Are we all good again? Bethany, how's that sound?
Good.
Okay. I'm going to continue here. So, Can people just acknowledge by nodding if you see the screen so I can look over? That's great. Okay, thank you. All right, so here's the Shared Crossing Research Initiative team. Like I said, you can just see me there, Dr. Monica Williams, our medical director, Dr. Michael Kinsella, our chief of research, Laurel's in the front. She's our administrator. And we have Noelle, one of our researchers, and another researcher we have, Michelle, she's not in the photo. But that's our team, and what we really do, I have to find my cursor. I've lost my cursor.
Has been nicknamed Noble Bliss.
Oh, hold on, I got it. There it is. Thank you. What we really found was, as we're doing this research, we're really focusing on the shared death experience. Like, what, people would come to us, we'd do a deep interview, tell us about your experience, and without going into the details of the experience, I mean, the interview protocols, the research protocols, what we found was people were telling us about a whole host of end-of-life experiences. And so we created this term called a shared crossing. And what this is this experience that can be had, it can take place before death, at the time of death, and after death. But all these experiences have something in common. They convey information about an impending death, or if they happen after death, about a continuation of consciousness in a relationship after the death of a loved one. And they usually provide a great deal of comfort for the dying, as well as for the loved ones and caregivers. And they're extremely personal, and most people describe them as a gift. So I'm going to show you our spectrum of end-of-life experiences. And this is what we found. Pre-death premonitions. So on the vertical axis, you see the phenomena, and then on the horizontal axis, you see the timeline. So we have approaching death, death itself, which is, we spaced this out. We found that death is not a moment in time, actually. Then we have after death communications of various types. So I'm just going to go through them briefly. Pre-death premonitions, pre-death dreams and visions, an event called terminal lucidity, the shared death experience, which is the pinnacle experience from what we can tell in the research, and we're going to focus on this today. And then we have these after-death experiences where the dead, if you will, communicate with the living. And we have one called a direct post-death communication. We have a whole host of post-death synchronicities, post-death dreams and visions as well, or visions and visitations. And you don't need to really know about this in detail. I'm not going to focus on it, but I just want you to know, that this is also what we do at the Shared Crossing Project now. We study all these phenomena. So now let's bring this up to present. We are in the era of COVID. And one of the big questions that's been surfaced that I get called about all the time is, hey, do we die alone? This is a question we have. And when I get called by different, media sources, they want to know, can you provide support for people about what happens when we die? Now, you're all, you're familiar with NDEs, and a lot of you are experiencers, I presume. So this isn't a question that you, struggle with, but the general public is struggling mightily with this. So the shared death experience provides a really amazing set of data by normal people to suggest that we go on. And what is the shared death experience? So it's really, I'm going to break it down into a very clear definition. So an SDE occurs between a person dying and his or her loved ones or caregivers. The loved ones or caregivers feel that they have somehow shared in the dying person's transition from this life to whatever lies beyond. The physical proximity of the loved ones or caregivers to the dying may be at bedside or may be at a distance, remotely, as we say. So Raymond Moody, who you are all very familiar with, he wrote, Life After Life and sold 13 million copies worldwide. Still one of the best-selling books ever. But he also wrote a book in 2009 called Glimpses of Eternity. And he was the first Westerner really to talk about the shared death experience. And but for some reason, this book did not catch on the way his other books have. But so really, I'll put this slide up because you all know what the primary characteristics of an NDE are. And you see them all listed here. Well, the shared death experience is basically identical, if not, similar, if not identical to the NDE. And what we did in the research initiative is we were able to verify that most of the core features in the NDE also exist in the SDE. We also constructed the first typology, which I'm going to go over with you today. And one of the things that's fascinating, and this is kind of a difference from Raymond's initial research, is we found that SDEs occur more frequently remotely than they do at bedside. And the theme that you're going to be seeing and hearing from the video presentations of the various research participants that I'll share in a moment is this theme of journey. This is also a dominant theme in the NDE, except the journey begins as a trajectory from the human life into the afterlife, but then they return. But in the SDE, the experiencer, who is the surviving loved one or caregiver, goes partway or observes part of this journey of their departing loved one, but they realize that they cannot go any further. So they, like the NDE experiencer, will come to a boundary. And we'll talk more about that later. But the theme, the dominant motif is journey. So just before we get into this, so how common are SDEs? The truth of the matter is we don't know. There's a lot of research on NDEs about the frequency of them. But of course, as you know, those tend to be stress-induced events that threaten one's life. With SDEs, we don't really know. But there has been research from the late 1800s on this, Society for Psychical Research in particular. Peter Fenwick and his wife, Elizabeth Fenwick, did a huge study on hundreds of cases. And their study was conducted from, I believe, 2008 to 2012, and they wrote up their findings in The Art of Dying. But that book, like Moody's Glimpses of Eternity, did not receive a lot of traction as well. So these experiences are still, for some reason, lying under the radar. So here's the first typology of SDEs. And like I said, I came up with this early on, actually. I had an advantage over a lot of researchers, and that was that I'm an experiencer. So when I started hearing these experiences, I had a really good idea about where they were. And so this and what was a real experience and what might be conflated in some way. So the three main types are bedside, that means you're present with the dying. Remote, that means you're not at the bedside. And there's a particular type of remote experience called a flyby. And I'll talk to you a little bit later, but this is a much briefer experience than a typical SDE. It's as if the experiencer is stationary and the dying kind of comes through with a message to communicate something. And we'll see one of these as well. And then there's three subtypes. There's a guided experience, and we'll see that a little bit later on. And then also there's a time variation. Sometimes it's early, delayed, or gradual. And that's kind of self-explanatory. The SDE, I'd say about 16 to 20% happen either slightly before the actual physical death or slightly after. And then sometimes it's a multi-person. That means there's more than one person having an SDE. And sometimes they're having a similar experience, and sometimes they're having a slightly different experience at the death of the same person. And you should know these subtypes can all happen with either the bedside or remote. And they can be, so the subtypes while the three main types have to be one of the three, the subtypes can go with either the bedside or the remote. All right, so if you're a little confused, it's going to get a lot clearer right now. So we're going to start with Cynthia, and Cynthia is going to be sharing a bedside SDE with her husband. And you should know that her husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2014, and he died in 2016. But he did not want to go into a memory care facility. So he elected to do voluntary stopping of eating and drinking to stop going to a facility, to avoid going to a facility. So what you're going to see is Cynthia, a few moments after, she's going to be talking about experience that happened a few moments after her husband, Shar, died. I want you to take a special notice of these features. We're going to go over these again later, but just so you know what we're looking for here. Notice the ascension, notice a greeting party, the light, and there's a co-experiencing of an OBE here. That means she's with him. She's really going with him. All right, I'm going to start this up right now.
So I remember lifting up out of my form, my body, and then taking my husband, his name was Shar, by the hand and pulling him up. And then I pulled him up past me, and then he pulled me up past him, and we kept doing that for a long time. I don't really know. So a lot of stuff was probably going on that I don't know about. And the sensation was very freeing. He was fully intact. He wasn't mentally compromised then. There was no sensation of constraint or discomfort from anybody's body. And then I saw the light. I almost feel corny saying that, but I saw the light, and it's not like a pinpoint light. It's it's huge light, and I told him that, look, there is the light, and we both turned towards it and went towards it, and then his mother appeared. And in the experience of the light, there was a complete wholeness sensation for me. A lot of freedom was in that. A lot, any of my own psychology wasn't there. None of that was there. It was just that opportunity to experience that. And then his mother reached to him, and then he reached to her, and he looked. He was still holding my hand, and he looked back at me and said, but I want to stay with you. And then he slipped away. And I think that was it. I don't remember too much after that.
So Cynthia's SDE is a really classic SDE that has some beautiful features in it. Particularly, as I said, like the ascension. She's a scientist, so when she saw the light, and she really, she kind of plays her cards straight up. This isn't something she really thought was possible. So she says she feels feels corny or awkward saying that she sees the light. For those of us who are near-death experiencers, we're comfortable with that language. But for her, this was a whole new paradigm stretching experience. I love the fact that she sees her mother-in-law, and that she actually hands off her husband Shar to her mother-in-law. Beautiful, beautiful scene. And she says it was a sense of wholeness for her, a sense of completion, I think is her terminology. So those really those kind of peak experiences that we know in both the near-death experience and that are also common and imbued in the shared death experience as well. So that's a bedside. That is a bedside experience. And now we're going to go to a remote experience. And this is a fabulous experience. This is Sonia. So Sonia is going to be having a remote, and she's also going to have a feature that we're going to see, one of these subtypes that's going to be called guided. And she's going to be guiding or assisting Denny. This is who she's with. So lay a little bit of context here. Sonia is a good friend, a student of Denny's. She is actually in Massachusetts, actually right near, I believe, Springfield. And this happened a number of years ago. But her friend, good friend Denny, is dying of pancreatic cancer in Santa Barbara. And she is unaware of the imminence of Denny's death. So we're going to dive into this, and we'll pick up some of the key features later. This is a really, you're going to get the motif of journey on this one, so enjoy.
At 7:30, I said, I have to lie down. I laid down in my clothes on her bed. And I never found out what the actual time of her death was, but that would have been 4:30 California time. I was aware that I was on this journey with other people who felt, I remember turning around and looking at just lots of people, and I felt like excited. I stepped off the boat and I was on sand. I looked up, and this was the most amazing part, whereas I looked up and it was sort of just crowds of people around me. I looked up and there was Danny, like just looking straight at me. And I thought, wow, like, wait a second, Danny's on this journey? Like, she's sick. Like, why is she, like, this is kind of a hard journey. Like, why is she here? But she was super excited and she wanted to go. And I was like, well, there seemed to be like some able-bodied people around. And I thought, well, we can help her go. But then she looked to me as if like, you can do this, Sonia. Like, and I felt this tremendous responsibility, like really me? Like, why are you picking me? There's all these other people that can help you up these stairs. But then I just went for it, and everyone was behind us. Like, Danny wanted to be like in the front. We started going up the stairs, and it just seemed like they were endless. Just would go up, and there were more and more. And I started feeling like we were sort of in the sky, and my sense of responsibility was like really intense, because we would sometimes sort of falter. She would kind of falter, and I would, like, you know, be grabbing onto her, like, you know, I'd feel myself shaking. It was a pretty intense kind of feeling, like I was responsible for making sure that she didn't fall. As we continued up, I suddenly looked up and became aware that there were actually people waiting for us at the end of the stairs, and it was very high. There was no more scenery. Couldn't see any earth, sand, anything anymore. It was just, we're in the sky. And yet I got the sense there was a room we were going to, and I looked up and there were two women. They looked like they were kind of in Renaissance dresses, you know, like big poofy, satiny, rust colored dresses. And they were super excited. They were like, she's coming, you know. And I actually kind of started having this feeling like, oh, she's the guest of honor. Like, and then I actually had this sort of selfish feeling like I didn't want to give her up, because I recognized that she was going to be like the center of attention when we got to the top of the stairs. We got close enough and they kind of pulled Denny into the room, sitting down on pillows, and there was going to be a dance performance. She was really happy, but there was this sense of waiting, which I questioned later, especially knowing how she passed. It was as if the timing was off, and I can't explain it any other way other than like she was early. And because there was this sense that there was supposed to be a spread of food, and I knew it was going to be there, like this massive spread of food, but it wasn't quite ready. And also the dancers weren't quite ready. And she did, when she sat down, she had this like beaming face, and she said, I made it. And that was just awesome to hear. And then I started having this sensation, just intense electrical kind of vibration in my body. And it was so strong. I felt like I was literally being pulled in an upright position. It was also a really wonderful feeling. It was wonderful because it was just like bliss, but I didn't want to leave. And I knew that I suddenly became aware in just like this split moment that she was dying, and that when I woke up, I wouldn't be there anymore. And I kind of woke up like literally with tears flying out of my eyes, like I was so upset. And I, you know, I actually aloud said, "Denny, I love you." Like, and then I woke up.
So, Sonia, I know once again, this is a remote SDE. She is 3,000 miles away. You get the sense of journey. So many amazing features here. The greeting party, the welcoming party, which we see, and the sense that she arrived early. And we've seen this a number of times. Now, Denny actually chose physician aid or medical aid in dying. And we have had a number of people in our study, I'd say a half dozen. And with every one of those cases, when there is some feature that lets us know that somehow they arrived a little early, which is just curious. So, yes, that's Sonia, and we will, so many features, but just really appreciate the vivid sharing she does about what she sees along in the various landscapes and terrains of her journey, this, you know, sharing this great transition.
At 7:30.
All right, so now we're going to do a flyby. And this is, I have Peter Fenix. Those of you who are familiar with the research know that Peter, I mentioned him earlier, Peter and his wife, Elizabeth Fenix, they're both doctor and nurses in Great Britain. They coined this term deathbed coincidences. And these are these coincidences, as they call them, that happen right around death, visitations, if you will. Well, we actually think these are just forms of shared death experiences. And we'll show you this experience here, which is going to be with Richard. I believe it's going to be with Richard. Yeah, it is Richard. So Richard, he actually hails from Pennsylvania. And so what's happening here is Richard is going to be talking about an experience he has with his good friend, Pat. Now, Pat has died. She actually, she dies unexpectedly. He did not know that she had died, but then he gets word that she has died, and then he goes for a walk, and he's going to explain that. So this is this is a delayed SDE. So why don't we listen in on Richard?
The experience was that Pat was in the hospital. She was not expected to live, and she died on the morning of, what was that, March 24th of 2016. She was other than my wife, she was my best friend. And so I was profoundly affected by this deep sense of grief. And I realized I just couldn't sit around or do anything in the house. I needed to get out and go for a walk. So I just walked down the street when I just had this strange sensation and a sense of something in front of me and slightly above my head almost. It was something sparkly. And that caught me by surprise. And then the next thing that I was aware of was that I had a strong sense of Pat's presence. And just that the fact that she was well, I could see in this image of her, I could just see her dancing and dancing for joy. And the words that came to me were free at last, free at last of her pain, and I got caught up in her expression of joy. And to my great surprise, I was feeling this joy, and that just sort of lifted me right out of this depression that I was feeling, and that really caught me by surprise. And I was aware of this, and I'm aware of the fact that a moment ago I'm feeling really down, and but now I'm feeling this joy, this being uplifted, and I remember picking up my pace and I'm walking along, and feeling this joy for her. But I was also joyful, and when I came back from the walk, I was just amazed at this change, and that stayed with me. It stayed with me for, I don't know, some time, some number of days, or it's kind of stayed with me all this time. I can't think of her without the sense of joy.
So Richard has this experience with his good friend Pat. He just goes out for a walk soon after he learns of her death. And in a certain sense, it appears that she comes to him. And she's dancing, feeling joy, happiness, type of euphoria. And he shares in this experience. Now, this is what we look for. The name speaks for itself, a shared death experience. He's sharing in the experience, the transition, or the initial stages of the afterlife with his good friend Pat. Yeah, and so we call that a flyby, because he's just kind of doing his thing, and she just drops in on him. He has this profound experience, and then she leaves. You see that he doesn't progress with her along her journey. That's what separates a flyby from both the other SDs, the bedside and remote. In those experiences, you tend to progress a little bit more with them. You see more of what they're experiencing. So, and that's a fine detail, but we're researchers, so we look at the details.
The experience.
So we've covered the three types of main types of SDEs, and now we're going to go to a multi-person SDE, and this is going to be with Amelia. So Amelia's at the bedside with her son Tom. Now, Tom is dying at a very young age of 13 years old. Very tragic death. He died of cancer. Amelia's going to tell you a little bit about her relationship with Tom and what he went through. And then she's going to share this profound experience. She has an amazing experience in terms of, you'll see that what we call this a presence that shows up. It seems to be somewhat in charge of the transition. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But then the shared part has to do with Amelia's sister, Charmaine, who will have a shared death experience of her own. So here we go.
Tom was sleeping. He'd moved downstairs, so he was sleeping on a sort of hospital bed, and I was snuggled up next to him. He was just breathing very, very gently, just a very gentle breath. So I set my head right next to him so he could his breath. And I closed my eyes. And then it's hard if you close your eyes and you try and imagine something. Like if I close my eyes now and I try and imagine a scene, I have to conjure it up. I can do it, Like you're using something in your brain, you're using a cognitive thing, aren't you? So if you close your eyes now and try and imagine something, you're using a bit of your brain to think, I'm going to see the sea, and you go to somewhere that you've seen, and then you see yourself. But you can almost feel your brain working. I can, to do that. But this wasn't like that. I closed my eyes and it was there. So it was like closing your eyes, and as you close your eyes, simultaneously somebody switches on a video. But it was just there. I didn't ask for it to come there. It didn't expect it to be there. I certainly wasn't thinking about anything spiritual. I wasn't praying or anything. I was just utterly focused on Tom's breathing. And so I just closed my eyes, and there instantaneously, immediately, was this video, like a scene, so clearly that I can remember it so clearly now. And it was a woman walking towards what I thought was me. I didn't think of Tom. So I wasn't really thinking of Tom. When I was watching her, I completely wasn't thinking about Tom, which is why when I came out of it, I thought, oh, Tom, what was I doing? You know, because I just saw her, and I just remember watching her like I watch a film, and I thought, she's a beautiful young woman. She's so beautiful. And I remember thinking, actually, I must remember this. I must remember this. I must remember that she's beautiful. And she had a pale face and a sort of slightly pointy chin, so her face was like a heart, with very pronounced cheekbones. She wasn't anybody I recognised, although I wish I could say I think it was. I can't. She had dark hair that was sort of like women wore in the 70s. She was wearing a gown, and it was one that kind of crossed over, and it had like a tie, you know, a proper gown that was like in white. And I think she might have been holding something in her hand, but that I couldn't remember at the time. I was thinking, I wish I'd looked harder. I just wondered if she was holding something. The main thing I remember thinking about her is, gosh, she needs to get somewhere. She's urgent, she's purposeful. And I remember thinking, but she's not running, she's not late. It's not like she's like I'm someone's late for a meeting, like out of breath. Or it was just that she had a look in her eyes like, I must be there at this time. But it was sort of somehow really important to me that I knew that she had to be at a certain place at a certain time, and that she was going to make sure that she got there. And then I looked what she was walking through, and it was a tunnel. I find it really difficult to describe that tunnel because it was dark, but there was light shining through it. And it wasn't like, if I looked at the walls of that tunnel, it wasn't brick or cement. It was like air, but it was solid. So the only way I can kind of think of comparing it to would be like a cloud. When you see a cloud looks quite solid, a dark storm cloud, but you can see the sun behind the cloud trying to break through. I knew there was a white light outside the tunnel. Out of the corner of my eye, I could almost see this incredibly intense white light. And I knew that white light was really good. And I knew when I looked at the dark tunnel, I thought, oh, it's a dark tunnel. But I knew everything was okay because there was this intense white light outside it and coming through it. And she was just coming closer and closer to us. And I think I opened my eyes and it all just disappeared.
Well, okay, so I have an apology. That clip does not have her sister's rendition of her experience. So I'll have to fill it in. Well, let's start first with Amelia's experience. And that is that Amelia, obviously, here she is, bedside, her son is dying. This being of light, this beautiful woman, as she describes it, shows up. And this is a feature as well. I won't go into it in too much detail, but in my mind, this is one of the most profound realization in my experience. I've actually had experiences when I have felt what we call the conductor. It is this presence that shows up. Sometimes it's seen, as in the case of Amelia. Sometimes you just get a sense that there's this guiding force, conducting, orchestrating the transition. And there's a purposefulness to it. There's an intention. There's even a sense of rushing at times, which speaks to the precision of this great event of human death and transition. So, and she also talks about the light and a tunnel. These are very features that you all are familiar with as NDEers or people who are interested in the NDE experience. What was not mentioned in this video clip, and I apologize, is that her sister has a similar experience. She walks into the room at the time that Tom is dying, and she sees Tom rising out of the bed. Amelia does not see this. She doesn't, you know what Amelia sees, but Charmaine sees Tom rising up and sees all the light streaming down and sees him kind of go up into a tunnel and leave. So that was supposed to be in our example of, let me see how to do it. Hold on, stop here. Okay. That was supposed to be our example of a shared experience. It was not, but we're going to go on to something else here, and that is Jean Denny is going to talk about her remote experience, and it's delayed. You'll see that she's in a plane going to see her father, who has already died the night before. She's about, this delay is about maybe 10, 12 hours, something like that. And you also see that she guides her father in his transition, which, you know, we don't try and understand the specifics of this, but you will understand once you hear Jean get into her story.
Like a lot for him to take in these beings. So, and they kind of redressed him. That's how I saw him. He was putting on this gold robe and put a crown on us. And now I remember that. I remembered that later. And he went up with them. And I got up to go to the bathroom. You know, I was on the airplane. And I was kind of like, well, that's weird. And I went back to my seat. You know, I'm making this up now. I went back to my seat then, and I said to myself, well, I should go with them. I mean, like, why would I just let him go? So I jumped back in. They're walking down toward, they've now reoriented him. He's walking toward this tunnel, and I get in the picture with him, and then he and I start having conversations. And this was actually my helping him die, you know, of course, this was, and I was excited for him. I said, Dad, you know, it's going to be great. You know, we're so grateful for you. I got to say a lot of things I didn't get to say when, you know, he was dying. So that was healing for me. We're so proud of you. I remember saying, you know, he had been really concerned about his obituary. And I said, you know, we wrote a great obituary for you, and you're, you know, all of these things. So we were just sort of chatting it up and saying goodbye. And then the point came where we came to kind of the edge of this thing. And it was kind of like, I like to say kind of like a manhole, but only kind of horizontal, or maybe it was a little up. I don't really remember. But I do remember it being radiant. I do remember getting there and seeing faces that I recognized, and elation, and yeah, even now I can get choked up about that. There was a great reunion there for him, and he was so amazed and so grateful.
So here you see, once again, here's Jean. This is a delayed one. The reason I'm showing you this is this happens, you know, 10, 12 hours after her father actually dies. She's in a plane, and she's breaking into this realm where her father is. And she actually uses the terminology that she was kind of assisting him with his transition, helping orient him to the light, if you will. And she talks about seeing the light streaming through the manhole above. And there's also other relatives there that she refers to, that she recognizes, her uncle there as well. So that is a... So yes, that is a guided and a delayed. So if you see our chart here, that's Jean has a guided, as she assisted her father, and there's also, this is the delay time variation. So the next one we're going to look at, you know what, we are done with our videos. So I'm going to go back for a second, and I'm going to point out one last thing here about Jean. Notice, once again, the theme, the motif of journey. Her father is journeying from this life into what lies beyond. And Jean is going along with him and observing where he is. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the key features. I'm going to do this relatively briefly because I'm realizing it's 8 o'clock for those of you on the East Coast, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers before it gets too late. So one of the major features is alterations in time and space. And we see that the shape and dimensions of room changes. These are for people at bedside. And if you're having this remotely, they'll talk about time slowing down, stepping into an alternate reality. Things get warped. So this is also a feature of the NDE as well, but it's really clear in the SDE because they're not being they're not having any trauma to their body. They may be observing the death or be present to the death of a loved one, but they're healthy in their mind. The other one we see is the soul spirit leaving the body. And this is often known in the folklore as the mist of death. It's like this, often it looks kind of like a replica, translucent vapor, or it can even look like a ghost. In fact, this may be where we got our notion of ghost from. But it rises out of the body, usually rises out of the third eye, the chest, or the crown, as this picture aptly represents. But we're going to listen to Sally talk about her experience of her mother's, at the time of her mother's death, she sees the spirit leaving her body. This interview for us as researchers is fascinating because the details she describes, she gives for what she sees at the time of her mother's death, you'll see is really spectacular. But here's Sally.
Very shortly after that, I saw this membranous type thing come away from the whole periphery of her body. And it was defined. It was definitely an edge. And as it came apart, coming up from the body to fill this thing was like this gray stuff. And I say stuff because, you know, I've been thinking about this since I talked to you guys, and I just cannot put my hand on anything specific to tell you what it was like. I mean, yeah, foggy, no, it had a little more particulate stuff to it. It was something in this form at this time solid enough that it was still in a three-dimensional thing for me to see. So it moved though, it congealed, and it slowly came together around her. And this membrane, and I think this had to be three-dimensional, but I could only see 2 dimensions in this thing. So this membrane opened like this and started going up towards the corner as a little bit, like, you know, like a feather edge started going up of the grayish stuff started going up with the tunnel. I called it a tunnel. I don't know if it was three-dimensional, but anyhow. And as it started to go up, the rest started to follow more solid. Now I'm picturing the room. I'd say about halfway up to that corner, it started going a little faster from the body, and the corner, and a little less fast up to the corner, where it started to disappear, this tube, and the edges of the tube anyhow. And it just kept going up, and soon it was all out of her body, and almost all disappeared at the top until the very last bit just went up fast.
I just love this description that Sally gives for this. Nowhere in our research do we have this level of description of the soul spirit leaving the body at the time of death. And that's not to suggest that this is happening all the time. I really don't know. But boy, her description is so profound. And what's interesting is that Sally will say in another part of this interview, when I ask her, what does this mean to you? And she says, oh, my mother was always, we always had conversations about whether you go on after human death. And she was always saying no, and I was saying, well, I think so. And so Sally says that what she saw was a gift from her mother telling her that, yes, indeed, we go on. Now, that's Sally's interpretation, but it certainly was really clear to her about what the meaning of this experience was. Okay, let's move on to the next feature here. Heavenly music. Oops, we're gonna go to I'm going to stop that one for a second. But going back to the music there, this is one that Raymond Moody found in his research, and we've done over a couple hundred cases now, and we don't see the music as much. We've had it maybe not more than a half dozen times, so it doesn't really rise to our list as a dominant feature. But we put it in just so you know that if you have it, it is known. Okay, so here's the mystical light, and this is perhaps, in the near-death experience, this is the most common and profound feature from what the research reveals. We see this mystical light as well in the shared death experience. It's not as dominant. In other words, it's not as overwhelming. It's not as, it's just not as voluminous or luminous, but light is around in different ways. As Jean's case, Jean Daney, if you remember, when she's accompanying her father, the light streaming through the manhole, she can sense it. And then the light around Amelia, the beautiful woman, light is there. And then just to be really clear, the first case, Cynthia Vitale, she talks about this light. She even says, I feel a little corny saying there was this beautiful light. So it's definitely an element. It's a profound element. But once again, it's not as dominant a feature as you see in the near-death experience. So the out-of-body experience. This is something that people report, the sense that they feel like their consciousness is going out of their body and they're going on this journey with their departing loved one. We call this sometimes a co-experienced out-of-body experience or a co-OBE. Sometimes they feel like they're there with their departed, with their loved one who's transitioning, and they're co-experiencing this OBE together. And then there's the co-experiencing the life review. We didn't have an example that showed that, but we do hear this a great deal. I think about 20% of our cases have this, where the caregiver or loved one will observe the life review of the person who's died. And it's revealing their life in intricate detail. It's comprehensive. It's often panoramic. And they feel the emotions that the loved one and others depicted in the loved one's life are showing. So it's a very emotional experience. Encountering heavenly realms. We see this all the time. Cynthia talks a bit about this. Jean talks about this as well. Richard Core even makes allusions to this glorious state. He doesn't really talk about the heavenly realms themselves, but the feelings there are sublime, peaceful, tranquil, joyful. So this is and you remember Richard said that he felt joy and peace for many days after that experience. Point of no return. Well, this is something that we see quite a bit in the shared death experience. The loved one is there going along with the dying, and all of a sudden it becomes clear to them that they can go no further. Cynthia had that sense that she was handing off her husband, Shar, to her mother-in-law, and she realized she had to go back. And once again, sometimes what they see is a visible physical form. Most of the time it's intuitive, or they're told by a guide there that, not so much told, they just kind of, the guide telepathically says, we're going on and you're not. By location, it was like I was in two places at once. None of the research, none of the people we interviewed that I share with you today said specifically that. But we do hear that when asked, how do you explain being in two places? And they'll say, oh yeah, I definitely was in two places. And I don't know how to explain that, but I was. And Jean did talk about that a little bit. Remember, she's in the airplane, and then she's going into this visionary state with her father, and then she's back in the plane. So yes, we do have that kind of bilocation with Jean. The most common description we hear for these experiences, as interviewers, we ask a number of questions, and they often say, I don't know how to explain this. I know this sounds crazy, but I just don't have words for this. So this is this ineffable state, and this is just a reality. We probably don't have a vocabulary for this other dimension, but we have found that our experiencers really work hard to help us understand their experience. Hyperreality, more real than real. This is a real beautiful statement. The experiencers will say things like, the landscapes were just pulsing or vibrating. I'd never seen such rich colors. There was energy flowing everywhere. And it was just so beautiful. And it was more real than this commonly shared human reality. Empathic felt sensations. I felt his joy and excitement. This is something that Richard gives life to. She says, I watched Pat. I could see her dancing with joy, and I felt it. You can see Richard says, I shared in this. A very strong interpersonal bond that's shared telepathically in some way that we don't really know how. Strong upward pull on the body. We did have this with Cynthia Vitale, as she ascended with her husband Shar, pre-handoff to her mother. This is common. I'd say about 15% of our cases will talk about being pulled from the chest or crown. Some express fear about this. That's why our education is really important, to let people know, when this happens, go with it. You're about to have a beautiful experience. Ascension and flying. We had some of this with Cynthia Vitale. This is really common, that they have this sense of, after just kind of floating, ascending, and always moving towards the light. Guides at the threshold. This is quite beautiful. Sonia talked about, Sonia did not have guides at the threshold. Oh yes, I'm sorry. So this is Amelia. She talks about the beautiful woman. And the beautiful woman seems to be conducting this process. It's serving as a guide to Tom, her son. And these guides often can be in the forms of multiples. We've seen 4 as depicted here. We've seen up to 6. And they all seem to have a role. And they all seem to be beaming with light. The next one here is this welcoming party. Deceased relatives and friends. Sometimes they're recognizable, sometimes they're not. But remember that Sonia talked about Denny being the guest of honor at a party, a gathering of friends. She didn't get the sense that Denny knew anybody there, but then she couldn't say for sure. Of course, Cynthia's case, her mother-in-law, Char's mother, is there to greet him and take him on the rest of his journey. Energy. We hear this quite a bit. Sonia talked about this, the energy running through her body, coursing through her body towards the end of her SDE. If there's any word, I think these are all energetic experiences. If you ask people, what were you feeling in your body? They'll often say, it was like I was alive, hyperalive. It was like there was electricity in me. And of course, love. This is perhaps the most commonly expressed experience, is the sense of ineffable love, indescribable, pointing to maybe the ultimate reality. So, these experiences are spectacular, but if they were just spectacular, they'd be important. But I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm more interested in helping people heal and really get some relief from their suffering. And what I love about the SDE and why I've dedicated my life to it is because people have a sense that their departed loved one is alive and well. They have a certainty of an afterlife. That any sense of fear or apprehension about death seems to dissipate. And this is very common, as you know, with the NDE as well. And for so many shared death experiencers, when they come back and work with me, they say, I just feel like that there's something I'm called to do in this life, and I need to get about doing it because I realize my life has purpose. And we will see massive changes in people's lives, changing of relationships, changing of professional careers, changing of friendships, moving physical locations, changing work, all these things as a result of a shared death experience. And there's also this enhanced capacity to reconcile grief. People have a container to hold their grief, this great loss in. And as Richard said so well, he lost his best friend in Pat, but yet he had a sense of joy about where she was, and he was able to carry that with him. This is spectacular when we think about how much people suffer from grief and loss around the death of a loved one. I have someone raising their hand. Why don't I take that in about 5 minutes, because I'm almost done. How's that? I want to do one specific case study, one specific after effect with Amelia. I want you just to listen to this. At the very end, she gives some really profound words about what this experience, the loss of Tom, meant to her. So here we go. Just stay tuned here on this one.
I think she was coming to meet him, and so I think it's, when you cross over, you're met by somebody, and she was there to meet him like a guide. It changes everything, doesn't it? It just changes everything. I'm not frightened of death anymore. It changes everything.
I love the way Amelia says this so openly. The shared death experience changes everything. Everything. And I'm not afraid of death anymore. Okay. A few more slides here. Let's see where we're at. So I just want to talk a little bit about the scientific medical perspective to the shared death experience. So, the core belief in science is that consciousness is dependent upon the human brain, human body. Oh, the consciousness is generated by the human brain. You're familiar with this, perhaps. The NDE was historically been referred to as a fear-death experience, a dying brain, biochemical hallucinations. Well, the shared death experience receives largely a similar response from the healthcare community, but this was a little bit harder to go with because the SDE really challenges the medical view of consciousness, because the SDE takes place in a healthy brain, in a healthy mind, in unknowing loved ones. So the current medical view cannot account for the SDE. the view of consciousness and view of mind in the medical community will have to evolve to make space for the shared death experience, because the shared death experience, as it comes online now, is very, very difficult to refute. And I think we should all stay tuned for this. The near-death experience has always had that shadow of a stress response, the trauma response. The SDE doesn't have that. This is happening in a healthy brain. Okay, I just want to say a few more comments here. So I have a book coming out with Simon & Schuster. It will be coming out in next January, February. And I just want to let you know that's coming out. I hope that you're interested enough in this experience to consider referring it or buying it yourself. But it's called At Heaven's Door, What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach Us About Dying Well and Living Better. Okay, so this is also something. So we are still conducting research, and we're conducting research on, I should say we're always conducting research, really. But we're interested in people's stories. So if you've had a shared death experience, we'd like to hear it. But we're really, really interested in these shared crossing experiences. So I'm going to just take you back to here, this chart right here. So if you've had pre-death premonitions or pre-death visions and visitations or synchronicities around the death of a loved one or a friend or what have you, we'd love to hear about it. And also, those are the pre-death experiences. And then there's the after-death experiences, which are the post-death communications, post-death dreams and visions, visions or visitations, the way we write it here, and any synchronicities. Please reach out to us. Our contact information is right here. And just send it to us at info@sharedcrossing, and our team will review it. So with that, I know there was a question. Let's go to questions. I'm going to look over at the screen here, so you'll see me turn to my side. I'm going to need help about how to get questions here. Laura, are you going to help me? Oh, should I stop presenting? Oh, right there. Okay, so I stopped presenting. Oh, no, not yet. Okay. Oh, I'm going to open the chat now. Thank you. I've not used this interface before. I usually do everything on Zoom, so this is new, but I like it. It's really good. Okay, so any questions first, or do we want to go? Oh. Okay. Yeah, I'm open to questions. Throw them my way. I'll respond. You'll have to unmute to do it. I can see everyone's muted. Yeah. Oh, you can type them in the chat. You can type them in the chat as well. Okay. So Jack has raised his hand. All right. So Jack? Good. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay. I wanted to ask when there are two participants, you have the caregiver and the dying, and they're in the transition, and they have the caregiver is the one who comes back and reports what he or she saw and did. Is there any way to know if the dying was sharing the same dream?
Great question. You know, sometimes there's communication between the dying and the loved one. Okay, so Jean Denny's case. Jean is the one who's on the airplane, and she goes into, we'll call it the afterlife, with her father, and her father acknowledges her presence. You remember that. And then she orients her father and says, listen, you need to kind of go to the light. And he orients, and he goes, starts ascending, and he actually then says goodbye to Jean, and that's it. So we don't know what he's experiencing, but there is a communication between them. And Shar, when Cynthia Vitale's example, when she hands her husband off to her mother-in-law, there's communication going on between them. If you remember, Shar says to her, I don't want to leave you, but I need to go. And so we don't know what they're experiencing. No, we don't have the privilege, at least at this point, of interviewing the dying. Only people we can interview and hear their accounts are for the experiencers. Did I answer that, Jack, in a satisfactory way?
Yes, yes, you did. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So if anyone else has a question, you can raise your hand or.
Lori has a question, William.
Lori has a question. I don't see Lori on my screen. I wish I did.
I can see her. Lori, can you unmute? There you go. I think she may be having trouble unmuting. I see she's still muted.
Okay. Okay, so Laura was helping me here with all this. I really appreciate Laura's help. Lori, I'm looking for you. It's 49 on it, so. 25. Okay, so Lori, can you unmute?
Yeah, Lori's muted and I'm not able to unmute her. Okay. So maybe we'll come back to Lori once she's able to unmute her device.
Great.
But I don't see anyone else with their hand up.
Well, gosh, usually there's a lot more questions. So why don't I would love to hear how people found this. Was it understandable? And I'm so familiar with these experiences. Sometimes I feel like I just assume people know about language and.
I have a question.
Yeah.
All right. What I'd like to know is, you know, that there are different stages, etc. Now, there's a stage after the departed has departed and the caregiver has come back. Now, are there any physical signs of this this journey? Are there any physical signs that the departed is ascending to the living? You know, for example, when people die, their family members experience unusual things, physical things, lights going on and off, birds as messengers. You know, they're you know, those. Are there any of those experiences, you know, happening with your shared death experience?
Great question. Yeah. So yes. So there is an experience that there's a feature that we call the sympathetic SDE. It's a feature, and this transpires when it's usually a loved one will have some sort of physical experience, usually concerning or painful, that lets them that they at the time they may not know anything that's going on. So I'll give one example. This was Sarah. Yeah, I actually have her video, but I don't have it right now. Sarah wakes up early in the morning, and she is in respiratory distress. She's coughing. She's vomiting. She doesn't know what the heck's going on. She's a firefighter, by the way. And you know, she's in her 30s, and her husband says, "We got to take you to the hospital." She goes, "Okay, let's go." And then she starts feeling better. Because that's weird. I don't know. That just came in. I feel a lot better now. Well, then she finds out, she gets a call about an hour later, that her niece, who she was quite close to, had died of a drug overdose about that time. So that fits. And we call that a sympathetic SDE. Now, we have a lot of these. We have, sometimes somebody will die of a heart attack and they'll have respiratory distress, trouble breathing in the middle of the night, think that they may be having a heart attack themselves, but it passes and they're okay. So yes, Jack, we definitely see that. And you asked another question about a physical change. I had something else for that. But it slipped my mind. Does that help with your response, Jack? Is that?
Yes. Could you give some examples of physical events that take place after the departed has departed?
Okay, great. So, yes, thank you. So here's something. This is with. This would be with Sarah. This is two people, Sarah and Leslie. It was Leslie's father, Larry, and Sarah's uncle, grandfather. And at the moment of death, the birds were fluttering and just making a tremendous amount of noise outside of the room where he was dying. He was in a senior community. And they said it was so loud with birds chirping and getting close to the window that they never heard such a cacophony. And so there's an example of a physical expression.
Okay.
Yeah. I wish, do we have more of those?
I have found that the majority of them are electrical in the event, like a garage door opening or closing, lights going off, blinking, computers malfunctioning, a refrigerator stop working for, those are electrical, and they seem to be dominant. And I assume that it's because we're electrical beings, and somehow the departed have some way of using their energy to turn on a switch so that the garage door opens.
Yeah. Peter Fennick has a tremendous amount of research on those types of deathbed coincidences. You nailed it really well. They tend to be electrical, clocks stop, lights flicker. Had we listened to a longer cut of Amelia's, she talks about Tom playing jokes on her and her husband with lights flickering, things being moved out of place, all sorts of things. Yeah, those are very common. So yeah, and I have to say, we don't collect as many of those. We would like to collect more. Most of the cases that we've been focusing on are these really in-depth shared death experiences, which are less about synchronicities and coincidences, but we would like to hear more of those. So if you have those, anyone on this call, please write them up and send them to us, and we'll probably call you and do an interview at some point.
When you send them to us, what's your email address?
info@sharedcrossing.com. info@sharedcrossing.com. And it's in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So thanks, Jack. I see another question here from Deb. Do you find that there are more women who have shared death experiences than men? Excellent question. And the answer is affirmative. 84% of our shared death experiences that we have collected are women. And that's a stunning statistical advantage, if you will. However, we have to be careful, because I think women are far more open to sharing these experiences than men are. But it may be that women are more open, more receptive, more intuitive, more spiritual than the modern Western man. I don't know. But we definitely get a lot more women. So yeah, that's a great question. And then you asked a question, Deb, about any children. We do not have any children in our research, and we would love to have them, but we don't. I should say we have one. We have one case. A gentleman from Belgium contacted us. So we have one. He was very young when his mother died. He was 2 years old, and he still remembers some aspects of the experience. But so we can't really say, we can't say anything definitively until we get a few dozen cases on that. Yeah, thanks, Deb. Bethany has a question. Does your upcoming book provide an overview of the process to follow to have a shared death experience? Overview of the process to follow. Bethany, can you unmute and ask that question to me in a way that I want to get clear what you're asking for?
Sure. Thank you so much, William. You mentioned earlier that you teach people how to have the shared death experience. So I wondered if your book will have information on that.
Yeah, we'll talk about what we see in terms of what are the characteristics that people have them, like who do we know that has them. One thing that we'll say is that, and we go into this more in the book, is that people who have mindfulness practices or have an openness to death, a receptivity to these phenomena, and this is why near-death experiencers are likely to have these experiences, because you already know that this is possible. We haven't done a study per se on whether near-death experiencers can have them, but since I give a fair amount of talks at NDE conferences and what have you, we have a lot of people from that community that share these experiences. So, yeah, I mean, I did talk about the protocols for having these. That's a whole set of training that I do and that my team does. That is not in the book. If you're looking for the training, you just have to contact us for that. And I'm sorry that they didn't want that. They were really interested in focusing on, was Simon & Schuster. They really wanted the experiences, and they didn't want us to be perceived as trying to sell anything. And I respect them for that. But I certainly was willing to let people know more about how they happen. But like I said, the near-death experiencers are perfect for this because your openness to death, the lack of fear about death, lack of anxiety about death and dying really helps enable shared death experiences. I see another one coming in here. Oh, all right, so now the questions are rolling in. Okay, so Deb Parker has another question. Did you reach out to assisted living places to provide classes? I have, actually, in Santa Barbara. And there hasn't been a tremendous amount of interest. And I wish there was. I'm just being really honest that they'll be fine with me coming over and giving a talk, but there's not a great deal of interest. I mean, I think the interest really comes at the level of baby boomer generation. I think the silent generation that comes before, when they get to assisted living communities, death is something that in my experience and what I've been told is they try to downplay it. So they don't want to have too much talk around death and dying, even though it's happening all around them. I think they're overwhelmed by it. So I hope that answers your question there. Okay, so now I see Lori asking a question. I can read this here. Lori, many NDEers talk about wanting to or going to hospice places to ease fears of others close to dying. Have you worked with NDE people who are doing this? No, I have not. This is a question about whether I know NDE experiencers who go to hospices and talk to them about their NDEs. When I go to hospices, I mean, I do a lot of training for our local hospices and hospices around the country, for that matter. At least certainly pre-COVID more than now. But I talk about the shared death experience because it directly relates to their population and what their population very likely will be experiencing soon. And a lot of hospice workers, I will say, hospice workers in general, hospice volunteers in particular, are our most common, you know, they're the ones who request our training more than any other group. So, of course, we have family members too. We have a lot of baby boomer women who identify as caregivers who come to our programs. The program that a lot of people take, it's called our Pathway program. And this really prepares people for what we call a conscious, connected, and loving end-of-life experience. And we teach the protocols there. So people really come out of that knowing, you know, how to apply these methods to have a shared death experience. And I should say, you know, we don't know why the shared death experience happens. We do know that about 50% of the people who have our training will have a shared death experience. About 80% will report some type of shared crossing, a visitation, a pre-death dream or vision. So they love the training because it really opens them up to all these experiences and multiple. So, okay. Bethany, go ahead. Why don't you speak, if you don't mind?
Okay, thank you so much. And I know Jack has his hand up too, so I'll be quick. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
was thinking that this shared death experience might happen only for people who are emotionally calm. Someone who is very resistant to or distressed by the death of the loved one or the other person might not be open enough to have that shared experience. I'm just wondering if your research, what you found with your research there.
I think you're spot on. I think our research, by the way, our research can't definitively state that if you're stressed out, you're not going to have an SDE. But it does highlight that if you are in a receptive state of mind, if you're, even if you're like driving a car or doing some habitual task like shopping, we have people that have flybys while they're shopping. Like they're literally just going through clothing racks and they're in that semi-focused state of mind, and all of a sudden they will feel a deceased loved one, a dying loved one come to them and pull them into another space. They might not even stop flipping through the aisles of clothing, but they'll bilocate. And we see this quite a bit. The other one is driving, especially if you're the passenger in the car. We have a number of cases like that. I think we have like 2 or 3 dozen. So yes, I think if you were to use that, if you know that those are the people who are having these experiences, and I can tell you that we don't have someone say, I was screaming and yelling, completely stressed out, and then I had a shared death experience. No, we don't have that. I was frantic and panicked while my mother was dying. We don't have that. So I think you're right on. And then, like I said, in the book, we talk about this, and sometimes I'll give full workshops on the conditions that enable SDEs. And you're right. I mean, if I were to say, if you want to have an SDE, have a mindfulness practice, get comfortable with that. Get comfortable with the fact that we're all going to die, and everyone you know and love is going to either die from you or you from them. And I mean, that's tough medicine, but I think it's worthy medicine. Jack, you've been waiting.
Okay. I have 2 questions. One, do you have statistics as to whether caregivers are more male or female?
Caregivers. Are you talking about caregivers who have SDEs?
Yes, I'm sorry. Caregivers who participate in the SDE. Yeah.
We don't have statistics on that. Like I said before, what we do have is statistics that say that I think about 85% of our SDE participants that share the stories are female. And they tend to be in the age range of 40, 50, 60, and 70. Basically baby boomers, mostly 50, 60, 70. Yeah.
The other question is, have any of these journeys between caregiver and departing involved someone who is an agnostic and who had no belief in the afterlife?
Yes, we have those. That's a great question. I'm just thinking about the data right now. Most of the people who have these experiences have some openness to an afterlife, have some openness to, they're either agnostic but they're not closed. Now, that being said, you listen to Cynthia Vitale. She was an atheist before this event. She was the one, she's a geologist by training. She's the one who handed her husband Shar off to her mother-in-law. We do have some of those. I would have to go back and look at that. Part of the problem is we don't ask specifically. We have started to ask specifically. We had so many questions in the early part of our research. As the research evolves, we're going to be looking more at that. Most of the people are kind of grew up with a religion of some sort, or whether their parents were practicing or the family was practicing or not. The end result is that they define themselves as spiritual, not religious, as a result of the SDE. Some may still be a part of their communities, whether they're Christian or Jewish or Islamic, Muslim, I should say. But but they hold that religion more lightly. They see themselves as more spiritual.
Okay, and is your study primarily by participants in the United States, or is it global?
It's a global study. I think you heard Amelia there. She was coming to us from UK. We have probably, I would say, as high as 15% from outside, maybe higher. I think 15% outside North America. We've got a lot of people from Canada. We have a handful from probably a half dozen from Australia, so Scotland, Netherlands, 2 or 3 from Norway, Belgium, Germany, Singapore. Yeah, we have a pretty good smattering. We're looking for more.
What about the Far East, like Indian or?
We have a few people of Indian descent, but they're living in the United States or living in Germany.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome. Oh, I'm sorry. Louise. Yes, Louise.
Yeah. I was wondering, people that have this experience that are living, do you have any statistics on how they are after they have this experience with the near-death experience, or the sharing with deaf people? Do you find any effect of those people that are still living?
Okay, so you were fading in and out. Would you mind asking that question again, Louise?
Yes, like a living person that has the experience of somebody that a shared experience or a near-death experience, and they're still living. Do you have any statistics on that, how mindful and how open they are in this life now?
Yes, great question. Great question. I love that question, because yes, that's a profound after effect. And most SDE experiencers define themselves as, I gave that slide earlier about the after effects, which they are much more, similar to NDE, loss of fear of death, sense that there's an afterlife, sense that they'll see their loved ones again, very peaceful and accepting the fact that death will happen. And a lot of them become more spiritual. One of the big changes is that they realize their life has meaning, and they have to go about trying to find out what what their most meaningful life can be. And one of the ways of doing that is doing more reflective practices, more soul searching, if you will. So yeah, and you know, also just a sense of I think that a lot of people say they're just kinder, less. They don't want to get stressed out. That material needs matter less. So yeah. Is that helpful, Louise?
Yes, a lot. Because also I find that a person in that state has to explore and expand and have an understanding of life with that, like you were saying, being more spiritual.
Yeah. I mean, the number one, when we start an interview out and we ask them, how do you identify yourself spiritually now or religiously? They will say, I'm spiritual, not religious. Over 70% of our interviewees will say that. And, you know, most of the time we're interviewing people who have had this shared death experience, you know, many years earlier, at least 3 or 4 years earlier, in some cases, decades earlier. So, yeah. Thank you.
If there's anything that you can do to help the general public have more understanding, because once you get exposed, a living person, once they get exposed to things, you cannot be the way you were before, and you're such more insightful and more realization. But lots of times you're in a solo world and you have to just have that self-identity of your own self.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah. Well, you know, we're trying to get the word out as well, and we certainly hope that this book is really supposed to be, you know, provide really wonderful stories, some of which you've heard today. But the book has 36. Is it 36? 28. I don't know what the editor decides. So 38 really compelling stories with much more detail than I can provide today for you. So we're hoping that will open people's minds and hearts to the possibility of this experience.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so is there any other questions here? I see a number of smiling faces, but I want to make sure if you have a question, this is a good time to ask it.
I see that Jack has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jack. I thought your hand was up all the time, so go ahead.
Okay. All right. My last question.
Sure.
You have read, I'm sure you've read Dr. Bruce Grayson's book, Afterlife. And
Yeah.
he us through, 40 years of research and scientific explorations and et cetera, to arrive at a sort of a conclusion. Excuse me. So the way he describes the NDEs from their many experiencers, the experience itself and the experience of your SDE with a caregiver and the departing member, how does that experience or that journey compare to an NDE?
Okay, so you're asking a question, how does the NDE compare to the SDE?
Yes.
Okay. So they're basically, you know, I should tell you this. I've talked to Raymond Moody about this a number of times, and to Bruce as well, although Bruce will say that he doesn't know the shared death experience as well as certainly Raymond does. But I've talked to other researchers too. So this is not just my opinion, although I'm probably the foremost researcher on this at this point in time. But the SDE and the NDE, in terms of phenomena and possible phenomena, are identical. The range of phenomena and experience for an NDE and an SDE, from what I can tell, are the same and limitless. The difference is every one of these experiences, NDE or SDE, is unique. They're all unique experiences. Like I said, they're unique experiences, but the range of possible experience, I think, is pretty much identical in both these experiences. My sense is you're talking about, you know, being in, accessing the same state of mind, the same realm, whatever that is, same dimension. I think it's the same thing.
Now, the characteristics that are defined by Dr. Bruce Grayson are, actually apply to your list.
I would
Okay.
say, yeah.
Very good.
So Bruce came up with the first, you know, NDE scale, if you will, the assessment. There's been a number of them since, but Bruce has really the foundational one, and it's a great scale. So I would say, yeah, there are some slight differences, but I wouldn't get hung up on the differences. That difference has to do with more the perspective of the experiencer, not so much the experience of it itself.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, you guys, we're at almost 9 o'clock for East Coast time. So, Bethany, do you want to say anything more? The host, I know there's a number of hosts here.
Thank you, William. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. I want to just encourage you one last time. If you've had an experience, our research continues to advance because of people like yourself who are courageous and gracious enough to take the time to write up your accounts and send them to us. To be clear, we do not study the NDE. We know a fair amount about it, but we do the shared crossing experiences and the shared death experience. So if you're, you know, able and willing to share an experience, if you had one, we welcome it and we appreciate you for offering it to our research.
Very enlightening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
But thanks to Deb Parker too, and thank you so much, William.
Yes,
and,
You're very welcome.
and Laura.
All right, so I think I'm the one who signs off. Is that correct, Bethany? Am I the host?